Hello, hello, hello.
All right. Well, thanks for coming out, folks. And I want to say thanks to Schuyler for putting all this together. So my name is Andy Cavatorta. I'm a sculptor. I work with sound and with robotics. And I work almost exclusively with physical sounds. And I usually hope to discover sort of new expressive possibilities. I don't always get there, but I do always make sort of incredibly inconvenient musical instruments, which is why I'm talking tonight and showing videos instead of hauling anything in here. So I'm going to talk about, it looks like 4 things tonight. I just finished this presentation about 120 minutes ago. So I'm going to talk about the history of this stuff, because I think it's super interesting. A little bit about the creative process, and a little bit about my work. And I'm going to mix in some stuff about lessons learned, because I think that's always the most interesting stuff with the stories, is when people tell you what they learned. So the history of a lot of this stuff, like, there's no teleology in it. When you see, like, from the 1600s up till now, there's a sense that this has just been the unfolding of what we've done as we've gotten more and more technology and new ideas, and societies have become sort of more abstract in their thinking. But I don't think that's the case at all. I think there's no sort of straight arrow of progress, going from a straight line from there to the present moment. I think it's been buffeted all over the place by unpredictable new technologies and social changes and how it all interacts with our own sort of unfathomable human natures. You could go so far back with this, but the place I start is usually clockmakers in the 1700s. They were starting to see something more, that there was more in these clocks than just keeping time, and there was more to mechanics than just that. They were magical enough if you thought about it. That the machinery was very concrete, but what it measured was incredibly abstract and ephemeral. I've seen the quote that clocks are to time as brain is to mind. You can see one of them, and you can't really see or measure the other one very well. So they felt that they were starting to see something mysterious going on just in the mechanical world and what came out of it. They were starting to see the ghost in the machine. And so they started taking a lot of this. A lot of you guys have seen these automata. So this one is the Draftsman, built by this family that made them for like 3 generations. They made 3 automata, which tells you a little bit about how complex they were. This one here is the Draftsman, and it could draw a variety of different pictures. The head moves, and it blows the paper clean. And all these parts in here, it's easy enough to think that this was just like an exercise in making and assembling. It's easy to think that this was just an exercise in making and assembling these parts. But I'm sure that this is actually like the tip of a very, very deep iceberg. So every one of these had to be sort of invented and prototyped. There was no internet to go look this stuff up on. So this one was a gift to Marie Antoinette. This one here is another gift to Marie Antoinette. Apparently that's what you did when you made automata back in the 1700s. This one, part of what I like about it is how creepy it is. Like the uncanny valley goes way, way back. And looking at this, if you play music, you might wonder, like, why not just make a mechanical dulcimer that played itself from the inside? But a lot of their fascination, I think, was in the question of what does it mean to be alive, which was something they were starting to ask because they had these machines that could sort of make decisions. They had mechanical logic. They had their own internal energy. They could take action in the world. And that question was sort of a lot more powerful at a time when the definition of life was more philosophical than physiological, as it is now. There are stories, I don't know if they're apocryphal, about like men falling in love with this particular object, projecting, believing that it had an inner life and projecting probably all sorts of awkward, idealized female notions, anyway. Slightly less problematic, these bird boxes were popular for about 100 years. It was already popular for gentlemen to keep songbirds. Beethoven kept one, everybody seemed to have one. And so like better than that was to have one of these little mechanical ones. Sort of a step up. And I'd point out, like the first ones here were for Marie Antoinette, and they were like wonders of the world. This wasn't a thing you could buy. These ones here, a little bit more affordable, but if you look at the craftsmanship, like if you're royalty, you could maybe end up with one of these. So here's a little bit of video from one of them. It's a little loud. You might want to bring it down. It's a little like a car alarm. I kind of like the one that's just exposed a little better. This one has a better song too. And you can see the double bellows. One bellows keeps constant pressure and the other one squeezes just to make the pitches. And all the data, no MIDI file, right? Like, it's all encoded on these gears underneath to see coming around. Sorry, it's kind of low res, it's what I could find. So if you can imagine making all this by hand, plus being able to envision it, like the idea that something from the realm of the spirit, right, which was music and songs, could then be encoded as geometry and metal. That was, I think, a very powerful idea at the time. All throughout Europe, the idea of quantification. A little glimpse of the actual whistle inside. So these were mostly for the very wealthy. And who else had lots of money to do this sort of stuff back in these days was the Catholic Church. So yeah, none of these were obtainable commodities. The Catholic Church, so this is a beautiful carillon from the Belfry at Ghent, around the same time. And you see that's like a big early programmable barrel organ where you stick all these pins into it and it will play different melodies on the bells in the church tower. Again, yeah, 1659. So a lot of this stuff, a lot of these ideas go very, very far back. And a lot of these strange questions that we're up against right now about what is real, what is virtual, a lot of these questions go back much, much further than you'd expect. And it reminds me of that William Gibson quote. I've heard it like a zillion times last year. It suddenly got popular. Do you know where he said, the future's already here. It's just not evenly distributed. And sometimes you look back and you see things like the Antikytheros mechanism in ancient Greece or something like that. I don't know if you've seen that. It's from about 3,000 years ago, is it? That early mechanical computer, like it looks like nothing from any other archaeological, well, it's completely out of time. It doesn't make any sense where it is. So one of the interesting things about music and history at this time is if this was where a lot of the intellectual energy was going. I'm not going to talk about tuning systems because that's like this crazy rabbit hole to get into. But it seemed like everybody in history who had any sort of intellectual success at anything took a whack at inventing a tuning system that would preserve the original just intonation and allow you to modulate chords. And we now know at this point that it was completely impossible. Millions of hours of intelligent people's time was completely wasted trying to figure it out. So one of the things that the church could afford if you were going to just get grandiose about it were pipe organs. Actually, this is an aside. Every once in a while in my work, I used to end up with a bunch of organ pipes as part of a project. And you'd have this thing where you'd be like, these are amazing. You'd be playing on them and hearing like the different types of voices that you could just get out of one of them. I'm like, oh, I should get a bunch of these. And then I could arrange them. And then I could have a control. Oh, no, that's a pipe organ. Like, I think that like 5 times a day. So there'd be like up to 20,000 pipes, hundreds of voices, and there weren't many outlets for genius back at this time. Like you couldn't design microchips, you couldn't engineer bacteria, you couldn't plumb the depths of physics unless you were Isaac Newton. But you could work on pipe organs, which for 3 centuries were the most complex things made by human beings. That's quite a run. They were replaced only by the telephone exchange in the early 20th century for complexity. And more on that later, because it's relevant. So if automatons were about creating these rare wonders that posed philosophical questions, the pipe organ amplifies the musical capability of a single human being by like 1 or 2 orders of magnitude. I think, but ultimately, it didn't belong to the person, it belonged to an institution. So the music was meant to be sort of like awe-inspiring in accordance with the church's idea of what the church was. You make the largest, most impressive musical instrument possible. Which brings us up to the end of the 1800s. So there was sort of a musical arms race going on there. Music in the home, especially if you weren't playing it, had long been considered like a status symbol. It was like a luxury of the wealthy. And by the end of the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution was doing a couple things. It was providing some more people. There was a new class of people with some disposable income. And it was also, you were also able to start making more commodities more cheaply. Somebody didn't have to handcraft something for a year and a half. Factories and mass production were starting to be sort of an idea. So there was an arms race to provide music without musicians in the home. And there were like 4 big solutions here, and they're all so different from each other. There's like, well, early radio, that's actually an early wireless telegraph, but that's just to make it contemporaneous with the others. And that's interesting with radio because like just the format of it is strange. It's all free, but you can't actually keep any of the music. And underneath, you guys know what this is? An orchestrion? It's kind of like a player piano, except you'd like try to pack everything in an entire orchestra into one of them, and it usually sounded like sort of like a bunch of chimpanzees who'd been trained to play music. Or I was listening to some, they usually sound awful, and I don't know if it's, I used to think it was that they were made that way. Or maybe it sounds like some people who are really good at sight reading music, like excellent at it, but they've been deaf their whole lives and they have no idea about the sensitivity and interpretation necessary to turn the notes in the page like into actual music. So like you could buy media for these things. You could buy rolls or discs or whatever you put in them, and they sort of worked at a musical resolution of the note. They didn't really go any finer or more sensitive than that. So sort of like early MIDI files, like you know the ones. In the upper right, the phonograph, or the old gramophone in this case. And it was similar to the orchestrion, but it had a much, much finer resolution. And its resolution was the individual sound wave. So you could record and preserve like the entire world of sound, like performances, live events. You could record stuff that was on the radio. You could take stuff from the radio and play it. Take stuff from the radio and record it, take recorded stuff and play it on the radio, of course. And the one in the lower right, looking like it's not at all in the right place. Do you guys know what this one is? Because it's so strange. You know what it is. That's the telharmonium, which is a story I'm so surprised it took me so long to hear about. We'll talk about that one in just a second. So you know the 2 at the top. So this is just one of this is a beautiful orchestrion. I just put it in here because it's a really nice one. It's hand carved. You can see, what does it have? It's got some piano strings. It's got like a glockenspiel in there. It's got like a couple tambourines. I don't know if it's a giant kazoo. So you can imagine more or less what that sounds like. And this one's one of my favorites. It was like presented as a wonder of the world at the 1910 World Exposition in Brussels. It's the Hupfeld Phonolist Violine. It's a violin playing machine. So it's player piano and violin. Just 2 things. It's bringing the focus down a little bit. In every one of these I've heard has sounded utterly ear-bleedingly horrendous, except I think it's just that it requires some obsessed person to come in and work on it, because I found this video while I was remaking this whole talk. Somebody, a pretty good job, actually. very Austrian sounding. Yeah, see, my ear's totally not bleeding, you know? It's not so bad. And I like that circular bow design. I totally stole it for another project. I'll show it to you. So if any graphic designers felt like a great disturbance in the force yesterday, it's because I was making this page. Like the arrows? Yeah. So the Telharmonium was this, so the world's first electronic streaming music service launched in 1899. Again, like the Andy Cavatorta device, like something completely outside of the timeline. It made no sense for it to be at that point in history. But it was successful here in New York City for about 10 years. It had 16,000 subscribers. Mark Twain had a connection in his house. It worked like this. It leveraged that newfangled instrument, the telephone, and people were trying to send music over the telephone, and it wasn't really working. You see in those old movies where the amplifier hadn't been invented. So you see it be like shouting into the microphone. The microphone has to be able to generate enough electricity to send a signal down those long, glossy wires through the whole exchange system and to power some speaker at the far end, which is why, yeah, you see all that, like, people shouting and trying to hear and the impossibility of long-distance connections and things like that. So that I think Thaddeus Cahill, its inventor, put together a few things. He had the idea of sending music over the telephone. He had the idea of, like, central power stations, which was a new concept. And Hermann von Helmholtz had just published in 1888 On the Sensations of Tone, the book that got everybody realizing that sound was quantifiable. It wasn't just something in the realm of the spirit. Like, he was taking it apart and understanding how frequencies worked, especially how harmonics, the physiology of the ear, it made like a little stir. So I think Thaddeus Cahill was looking at all three of these ideas and sticking them together and saying we could broadcast music. There was no radio yet. You could broadcast music over the telephone network. So the way it would work, you would pick up your old school telephone, give it a little crank, tell the operator you'd like to be connected to the Telharmonium, and yeah, seriously. And then you'd take the paper cone that they'd mailed to you, which was probably brought on a horse, and then like stick it in there and hang it back up on the wall. And in the upper right, that's 144 separate dynamos creating AC electricity to 65,000 watts, I think, because there was no amplifier. You had to generate the musical signal powerful enough to drive hundreds or thousands of telephone speakers way out at the other ends. And on the left here, one of the two utterly preposterous dynamophone keyboards, which like didn't have any accidentals. They were just like all these keys side by side. One player played the pitches and the other one played the dynamics and harmonics, if you can imagine how that notation looked. And so two people played this 24 hours a day, basically. And everybody, I mean, they let some people go home and others came in, but like, and so when you pushed keys or combinations of keys on these two keyboards, this switching room in the lower right would connect these huge dynamos spinning at different frequencies of AC electricity through there into this like bunch of tone mixers. So you know, like when you've got a little tone mixer, like this is what it looked like back then. This like giant stack of like iron and copper. And then through the telephone exchange out to all these telephones, completely ridiculous, kind of amazing. And people were doing like strange experimental music things with them. Like at Delmonico's, there'd be a live stream of music from the Telharmonium, and they'd have local musicians who would play along, sort of to add to this with a mixture of like the dislocated player and like the present players, and doing stuff that sounds very much like experimental stuff you'd think of now in the age of the internet, et cetera. So it had a ton of problems, fire not being the least of them. Well, because it's a lot of power to put onto phone lines. There's a story, and it's in the big history of it, and it's sort of apocryphal. It's not, that there's a big, this was underneath Radio City Music Hall, the final version. And I forget, I guess it's on Broadway, there's a fire in the telephone lines, and they pull the manhole cover off, and all this smoke comes out, and from all the crossed wires with all this power, there's like this weird, eerie music coming out from under the ground, and this like bunch of horrified New Yorkers, you're not used, like if there's music somewhere, there's musicians there, underground in a fire, still performing. Like, it wasn't really clear what was happening, long story short. So let's get a look at this thing a little bit more. So that's one of the tone wheels. Yeah, again, like this whole thing was made in an era where these, to put it in context, these parts were almost certainly, they're all made by hand and they were transferred like on horse-drawn carriages. I don't know, streaming electronic music. I like his idea. Yeah, so there's not a single, I think the reason we don't hear about this is that the end of this story is unsatisfying. There's not a single recording of it. No living human being has ever heard the first analog additive synthesizer or the first electronic streaming music service. It shut down in 1916, and a few decades later, the entire thing was sold for scrap. If there are any pieces of it left at all, they're just somewhere out in the whole untagged detritus of the mechanical junk world. So yeah, just gone, just stories now. I think I have a client who wants me to make one, but I'm going to get... Yeah, you can guess what company would want to own this story, but I won't say anything yet. So anyway, so here's where we go. I'm going to start to talk a little bit about process. I'm going to talk about my work in just a moment. What on earth do my notes even mean? No research or development. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the dark forest of possibilities and the importance of fake rules in that context. There's a point at the beginning of every one of these projects, yes, where you haven't done any research or any development and all the ideas are still tested, and there are many outcomes. It feels like you're standing on the edge of this gigantic dark forest full of all these paths. Many outcomes are out there on the other side, and you come to branches 10, 20 times a day, and you can't see very far down them. You don't really know. You're going to invest in choices and decisions, and partly it's just decision fatigue that like makes these things so difficult that you end up getting exhausted. And so I ended up inventing a set of I tried to come up with rules that would tell me what to do at every single juncture. It would help me sort of speed my way through this whole thing, because making all these decisions like 20 times a day when no decisions at all are carved in stone, that ends up feeling far too complicated. And it turns out, though, every single rule that I could think of had some exception to it. Like no matter what it was, the simplest of things, even like what I thought made good music, as soon as you start to think about what you think your rules are for what makes good music, there's exceptions that you totally love. So I was like, fake rules, I like the sound, that makes a lot more sense. So before I talk about my work, I'll just talk a moment about fake rules, and that's more or less, they don't tell you the proper answer, but they do help you get through the dark forest of decisions a whole lot faster. First one, on sound alone, that when making new instruments or making installations or things like that, the music should be compelling, even if the audience has no idea how it's made. That's one that I chose for myself. Or the idea that the experience is more important than the concept. And I sort of learned this the hard way when I first started doing performances like this with a group a while back called Ensemble Robot. And we could pack a venue. And the first time we did, we knew that this was in Boston in 2006, and people were like, you mean you have both music and robots? Everybody was incredibly psyched about it, and curiosity brought everybody in. But their curiosity was satisfied within about 90 seconds of the beginning of the show, and we still had 45 minutes left to go, which means you'd better have brought something a lot more worthwhile than just novelty. And another one's about duration, that the value of a piece is proportional to the duration for which it's compelling. I know there are exceptions to this, but I take this one on as this one's actually never steered me wrong when I'm trying to figure out which way to go on a project, and I'm always like, is this going to make it interesting for a longer period of time? And I always choose that direction, and I've never regretted any of those. I'm sure there must be great performances that last 4 seconds, but I don't think I've seen them. That's a tough format. So another one, fabric is greater than architecture, that much of what makes music work happens at a resolution smaller than the notes on the page. So it's not the notes, it's how you play them. So if you're creating instruments, it's really important to create some that have enough sensitivity to make fabric and not just the outlines and the notes. Again, there are exceptions to this, but I think it works much, much better. You end up with a lot more options if you do it this way. And then second to last, necessity. Nothing's added for show, no gimmicks. You take what's necessary and you make it beautiful. So like no Rube Goldberg contraptions that take in a stream of music and run it through some sort of big rat maze and then like push it out the other end and then you hear it. I say that because I get clients who ask me for that sometimes. And then lastly, for me, humans on both ends. Music that's composed, improvised, performed by humans. Like I don't want to do sonified data sets. I don't really want to do algorithmic music. Just because when I say, I know there's people who love that, but I don't, so it would be inauthentic. Also, I like to know that a human has sort of bothered to fill the music with something to share with other people. And so people ask me, like, what if the algorithm is really good? And for me, there's so much of it is about the emotional connection in the music. And it's sort of like saying, how about falling madly in love with a chatbot somewhere? It's like, no, but what if the chatbot's really good? And you're like, no, that's actually not the point. So I'll talk about work. I designed and created the gravity harps for Bjork on the Biophilia tour. And I met her when I was a grad student at the MIT Media Lab, and we collaborated on a whole bunch of instrument concepts for about 6 months on and off. She wanted to get forces of nature in on the act. She wanted electricity in there. These ones here were very much about gravity, and I was trying to find ways to turn gravity into music, like how small does a pendulum have to be to actually ring in the audible spectrum? It turns out, like, before I suggested that, I had to go do the math. It's about 1/5 the wavelength of red light, so no, that's not going to happen. So gravity in this case is just used to set the rhythms of this piece that plays out very, very metronomically. I've got a little clip of it here. Also, there's some robotics to keep it all energized and synchronized. And actually, I never shot any video of that because I was always the one operating it from the edge of the stage under great anxiety, not wanting to do anything else. But there's a pretty good video of it here from the Biophilia show, from the Bjork retrospective at the moment. So you can see it a little better with no distracting Icelandic singer in the background. All of these can rotate to change their pitches. And the behind the scenes part of this is, that was the first prototype where I was really just trying to play around with pendulums and rhythms. I sort of like this one just as much. Largely because it was made out of stuff that was just sitting around in my apartment. And so I'm going to mix in some lessons here because, well. So this one's about tuning and that you have to use your ears. When I was building my very first instruments, I was like, well, how should I tune them? Well, I'll just tune them to the pitches because everybody knows what those are. But lots and lots of instruments actually have their own tunings. Piano is the instrument that got everybody in Europe using 12-tone equal temperament for everything, but even the piano is not actually tuned in 12-tone equal temperament. Way out here at the ends, it uses what they call stretched tuning, where the higher pitches are tuned higher and higher as you go up, and the lower ones are tuned lower and lower. And that's because the harmonics down here on the left side are sharp, which is why it has that somber timbre to it. And it's more important for the harmonics to be in tune than the fundamental pitches. And up on the other end, that plinky timbre is because those are all flat. All the harmonics are flat. And again, it's more important to have the harmonics be in tune. So early piano tuners, if they were tuning them by ear, I'm sure they just got it until it sounded right. So oftentimes if you're inventing instruments, especially physical ones that are full of harmonics, you really, really have to use your ears in the process. And that was true for these here. And they had that strange sort of unusual timbre because the tension in the strings was very low. And it gave them very uneven harmonics all the way around. So first you'd go through and tune them with sort of a digital tuner, and then you'd knock some of them up or down by 5 or 10 cents. Next one, this is the Dervishes. Originally commissioned by TED and by Lincoln Automotive Company, which was giving away a lot of commissions that year. This image is from taking them to the Royal Opera House with Matthew Herbert for an adaptation of Faust called The Crackle. It was on stage as the personification of Mephistopheles, and it progressively kills off a choir full of children every single evening. It's fun. No, they come on and they're sort of singing duets with it, and it's kind of sucking their souls, and they slowly drop in these little red gowns. But instead of explaining it, I'll just show you. And the big thing I learned on this, it doesn't actually sound related. but it totally was. And this has to do with sort of the emotional component of building these things. That got built in 5 days. I originally got word of the whole thing 3 months ahead of time, and we were talking about them sending me the funding to do it, and then it was 2 months, and then it was 1 month, and then it was 3 weeks and 2 weeks, and 1 week before it needed to be out in Palm Springs, California, we actually finally got the money. And I was like, do we do this or do we not? And so, yeah, in 5 days, I just decided to do the leap of faith. There's a Leonard Bernstein quote that in order to accomplish something great, all you need is a good idea and not quite enough time. And this is what I was thinking about a lot at the very beginning of this. So we did a bunch of like turning money into time where we get extra hands, we order all the parts that we could possibly need and every variation of it all at once. People are sleeping on the floor in the workshop. And I was progressively getting more and more worried, but a little bit more chilled out than the people around me, because like this started on a Monday and needed to be in Palm Springs the next Monday. Wednesday came, and that was our last chance to get it through the airport process at both ends. Came and went, we're not done. Thursday came, that was the last 18-wheeler highballing out of Brooklyn, headed for Palm Springs. And people are like, what are you gonna do? And I'm like, I have a plan. Friday came, we finally got it finished, like after midnight. And then the composer, my friend Molly, came in and she wrote the music in the wee hours, and then the sun came up in the morning and we mark all the parts, we disassemble everything. And I looked on Google Maps and it said you could drive from Brooklyn to Palm Springs in 50 hours. And I was pretty certain we could do it in 40. So we put it all in the back of a suspicious-looking white rental van, and I got my friend Carl. No, we've both been up. We haven't slept since Friday morning, and before that, we'd been catching like just a few hours of sleep every night, and we're about to do this. We're like, oh, we'll just rotation drive, but neither one of us was safe to drive without like observation. Like, so we continued to stay up more or less for another. That's the first time I ever had Red Bull, and probably the last. Like. That actually works, you know, like you can have it and then you can have it again a few hours later, and you just keep having to increase the dose. It's fine. It's fine. I remember nothing from this trip, but it's fine. And we end up out there in this like expensive resort. It's like the Matrix. I think there's like only 7 colors in the whole place and everything's color coordinated. I mean, like even the shrubbery is color coordinated. And we're like stinky and disheveled, and we put this whole thing together that like, it's an arts commission, and it's very brutal looking, you know, like it's this giant chunk of steel and like hardware store stuff with sharp edges on it. But something about this, its ethereal voice and the brutality of like I was feeling terrible. I was feeling awful about the whole thing. I was like, I'm never gonna do another one of these projects. This has just been an awful experience. Nothing is worth this. This took a year off my life. It's ridiculous. But the whole thing turned into this love fest. Like everybody loved this project so much. It was swamped like every day and every night, and like people I know, like have never met, but like respect from a great distance were coming through because it's a TED event and they're all like saying wonderful things. And I felt myself completely rewriting all the memories that I just had like in the past week. Like, and I'm turning all of them into this, instead of this horrible tragedy of me being some giant loser, to being like, no, this is the success you can have if you just like keep believing and keep pushing and just keep being like, that's what, and like, so this is sort of the emotional lesson that came out of this, was yes, how to change. You can change the past sometimes because the end of the story recontextualizes everything that came before it. And sometimes the story isn't over yet. And that's a thing I've had to remind myself of numerous times on subsequent projects when everything is like, where you're like, I can't imagine how we'll possibly succeed at this. And then you do. So let's see. This one breaks one of my rules. I'm just using electronic sound instead of like purely physical sound. I don't care, that's fine. So this guy, J-Views, he's really fun. He's a musician I like to work with. He got this viral video by using makey and a bunch of vegetables. And suddenly he had all these sort of corporate sponsors ask him if he wants to do something. So Snapple came and said, would you like to do something again with vegetables? He says, fruits, how about? He's like, no. Like meats, no. I don't think Snapple asked him to use meats in the synthesizer, but still. He said, why don't we do something with rain? And he and I were talking about it, and I've been loving and listening to just the patterns of raindrops. They don't really make repeatable patterns, but they have this really, really recognizable sort of set of non-repeating rhythms that they fall in. And he and I were talking a lot about partial control, about what happens when you have too much control and you don't have proper constraints. And he works a lot in an environment where he has like complete control. In a way, this is like why painters haven't given up painting for Photoshop. Because when you're painting, you don't have 100% control over exactly you learn to be in a dialogue with the material, and things emerge from the process that you learn to sort of manage yourself. And this is why people's styles look so divergent from one another, which is not so true in, let's say, Photoshop or something where you have complete control. So anyway, I sold him on this idea of making something specifically with the rhythms of raindrops. Like, what could possibly go wrong? percussionist Manu Delago, who was doing that beautiful stuff on the hung drums, he just happened to be passing through New York. Like, he had a long layover at JFK. And we were like, well, come on over. We're doing this gigantic shoot. And he's like, okay. And he shows up. He's like, what are we doing? And he's this miraculous guy. You just like add him to anything, and it turns out just beautifully. So yeah, note to self, always use Manu Delago if it's at all possible. A thing that didn't get it in there was I've been playing around a lot with the light and with the ripples. It's what I was hoping we'd do before I realized that the ad agency was going to come in and control what happened with the lighting. And like this, that big tank overhead really looks like it should have a brain in it, doesn't it? And down below, we had these like totally sort of Barbarella colors in the ripples. I don't know what to do with this. I liked it so much, it was disappointing to not get it in the final. I'll have to put it in something in the future. And so, yeah, lesson 3, there are benefits to limited expressiveness, but I only really understand them in retrospect. Like, I don't know why. I always think of the Hammond organ. Like, you know, the piano displaced all the other keyboard instruments in Europe because it was the pianoforte. It could play loud and soft. It was like this crazy new feature. And people could not get rid of harpsichords fast enough, like, to replace it with something more expressive and less abrasive sounding. And the Hammond organ comes out, this electric organ, and it's no dynamics. Like, you hit the key soft and you hit it hard and you get the exact same volume level. But when it became so much more popular, it could have a really sharp attack time. And it all turned into stuff about timing. It was all about the rhythms that you could play and the fluidity and how you weren't playing. You hear all that, like, the snazziest music in the world, all that organ jazz. It's like it's all about just that stuff with timing. So that's one of those cases where there's a limitation. You don't have dynamics, but people explore and discover something else. When the page is blank and you're going to create a new instrument, I have no idea how to put together like a set of a combination of expressive dimensions and constraints that are actually going to be successful. I don't know. Figure that's the next thing to learn. If any of you know, talk to me afterwards. So let's see. Oh, this was a commission from Stella Artois to create 4 instruments using like their iconic chalice. And I said yes before I'd ever even heard the glasses, and luckily they actually sound great, but it was a bit of a risk. They could have been totally awful, and then we would have had taken twice as long. So the brief showed like a chopstick and a solenoid sort of banging on a glass, and like we definitely went like way, way further than I think they expected or wanted. So there's 4 instruments in the set. One of them is percussion. It just made tuned glass bells and mixed them in with some steel bells because the timbres were really nice together. And that has dynamics, so it can play really quietly and loudly. And sort of an organ with a sound shaped by the glasses. You know, just like your mouth shapes the tone at the top of this vibrating column of air, like ah, wah, wah. By adding different shapes onto the bottoms of these sort of organ tubes, you get different timbres. One of them is with bowed glass, again with like tuned glass chalices. And one's a 60-stringed instrument with glass resonators on the inside. And this was the one where there's like a 30-minute documentary about it, and there's like these like 5-minute spots that were these web ads. Were they 5? Let's say maybe 2 minutes. Anyways, they were different lengths. And I did not, in the end, get a single good live recording of any of the instruments, except when we were doing our tests in the studio. Just because at the very, very end of the project, they were like, I don't think there's budget left. So the first one's a pyrophone, and it's named after the original pyrophone from about 1888. And the original one's just gorgeous. It's when like gas first started coming into people's houses, and people just wanted to use, and we still do, pretty much anything available to try to make music. So this guy invented a beautiful sort of organ that would create music using gas flames. And it's not a gimmick. The gas flame is not just a way of moving the air. It is what vibrates. It's like the reed in a saxophone or like the cut up in an organ pipe. And in the old photos of it, I don't know whatever became of it, but you see these photos of this enormous glass instrument full of all this flame in this wooden building with a low ceiling hung with sumptuous drapes and other flammable things. So I have a suspicion about what happened to the original. There you see some of it with the glasses used to shape the tones. Were the tones better with the Stella chalices in there? No, but it gave us some variety. They were just different and interesting. So this ended up being the most popular one of the whole set by far, even though it was the least musically articulate. And you couldn't keep it in tune for more than 10 minutes at a time. But, so I'll show you a video in a moment. Here I am not figuring out how to get any sound out of the tubes. So this didn't work. But yeah, as usual, like we'd seen pictures. Like here's a picture of a thing that worked in 1888. Here's a video just of us playing around, and this was our first tests. So the mic on this can't really reproduce the low tones. It would like shake your body, and it would shake the floor. It had such powerful undertones, and it was loud. It was loud like a foghorn. So that plus 2 or 3 octaves underneath that. And this is the one that plays with the bowed glass. Oh, I forgot to say, yeah, there was also an element, the band Cold War Kids was part of this whole thing too. They ended up using these instruments to write a song. I forget about that part. But let's see. Oh, these are out of order a little bit. I don't care. This one was the Hive, and it had a few octaves of tuned glass. We would take the glasses and carve them down to specific pitches. And if you look at it up close, it looked a lot like this. And I just have the incredibly creepy sounding test sequence here of the previous version. Like the final one here, where is it? It's nice, it's all steely and reflective, and the whole structure disappears because it is so packed full of ugly wiring and stuff that nobody wants to see. But if you did want to see that stuff, look like this. And we would just act out horror movie stuff while this happened. But all channels firing. It's funny, the random number sequence here sounds like even just random on this thing sounded nice. And you hear both. You hear the round pitches, the round tones of the glass, and the sharper, brighter steel bells. So back to that, this one here is called the violina, you saw just a moment ago. Here's where I borrowed that circular bow from the Hupfield Phonolist violina. So circular bow goes around, and the glasses can be brought in and out of contact with the bow. You can play it with a keyboard. You can change the speed of the bow, and you can change the pressure on the glasses using the pitch and mod wheels, because bowing is hard enough with your fingers. Trying to do it with all this like technology in between, it ended up being like a ton of software to get just the right contours and just the right voices. So here's what it looked like. First motion test to see if all the sensors and motors are hooked up correctly. I kind of like it without the glasses. And then a super low-res video, but you can hear it. This was our first test of the sound. You can enjoy both pixels. And you can hear the different voices and the different pressures. It's funny, it's very physical sounding. And another quick video with the Hive and the violina together. Everybody looks worried in this video. It might be just the music. And so, sad lesson learned. If you don't record it, it didn't happen. It's like the telharmonium, right? You're like, oh, is this a great thing? And nope, nope, doesn't exist. And so here's the, the sound on this is very low. It probably needs to come up. This was me just playing with like electromagnetic resonance and strings, and the idea of getting strings, piano strings, to ring in multiple frequencies at once, because they can ring in all sorts of different harmonic modes. And so even though it looks like she's playing a synthesizer, it's just a MIDI keyboard going through a bunch of software. All these sounds are physical sounds coming off of piano strings. And she's just sort of improvising here, but I got asked by Motherboard TV to do something, and they had this tiny little budget, and my friend Molly, who's improvising here, wanted to do something too, and I was like, sure, how hard could it be? Like 36 little hand-wound magnets and 36 small amplifiers and a custom microchip design on an FPGA and a stack of software to match up all the... No. So, lesson 5, there's no small projects in robotics and sound. It's still going to be like 200 emails and like 20 hours of meetings and like ridiculous late nights. So, let's see, second to last, instruments for aquasonic, and I only made 2 of these, but they finally have a really beautiful video. There's a danger when you work a lot with composers. The beauty for me is that I work with people who are going to write far better music than I would, but sometimes they don't, or sometimes they don't learn to play the instrument. But in this case, I wasn't sure if that was going to happen, and it did in the long run. It took them like a year or so, which is about right for learning to play something, especially when you're learning to play it underwater. So their concept is very much, they're asking I have a slightly less gimmicky sounding version of it, which is they're asking the question, what if music evolved underwater? They're run by these 2 Danish conservatory musicians who, they're avid swimmers. And they got obsessed with how things sound underwater, and they were thinking about evolution and the origins of life and things like that, and what we could do around that. Anyway, I'll let this speak. They perform underwater. And I built for them a long hurdy-gurdy-like instrument, and also an underwater glass harmonica. kind of just want to rescue them half the time. But I won't talk too much. I thought that would be difficult, making instruments that played underwater, and it was like 10 times more difficult than I expected. The only fun fact coming out of it is that those things are all lubricated with olive oil, so those people they smell great getting out. And the last one, so I'm working with Wally DeBacker, who went by the name Gotti for a little while. I think he's finished up his Gotti project. He had that big hit like 5 years ago, if you knew it. 4 years ago? Anyway. And he's just been collecting with all of his like money, millions and millions that he made on that big thing. He's just turned into this like avid collector of every imaginable like antique musical technology, including a whole family of RCA theremins he just keeps buying. And like, I'm helping him put together a big collection of about 50 different types of drum machines, including like lots of old crazy rhythm boxes from the 50s and 60s and older stuff with like vacuum tubes and motors and stuff inside, and getting them all under one sort of common control so that he can use them all as one gigantic live vocabulary. And I first asked him, like, are you going to be like layering lots of beats? And he's like, no. And I'm like, oh, good. Let's do something, because we know that doesn't stay more interesting after 2.5 of them. So yeah, I'm really excited about what happens if you just take all of those bass drum sounds and you use them as one palette, or they all have such weird things in them. But also a bunch of them, well, I'll show you. This was like one of the first times I'm making a control system for all these and sort of an abstraction that is able to talk about all those sounds so that he can just pay attention to sound, and all the actual turning the sound into whatever the machine has to do happens out at the outside. Just first fun test of putting them all together. It's such a spaghetti factory. But also doing like, not quite circuit bending, but a lot of these old analog drum machines can be pushed in directions really carefully, like way beyond what they originally were intended to do, and just messing with the clock speeds and things like that. And so a lot of what we're doing is figuring out all these other voices that are inside, and then sort of getting them under very intentional, articulate control so that you can make composed music with that. It's a maestro rhythm queen, like a... Anyway, you get the idea. And that's it.